Hello, my name is Casey Murano, and I'm very grateful to Riverview Art Space for this opportunity to share my work and some reflections on my process. So these paintings were all conceived through practices of pilgrimage, through physical journeys that prompted spiritual growth. Whether biking to the James River in slow gallops and left at the Z, or walking around the West Hampton Lake to visit the ducks in contemplative maps, or returning home to the mountains of Roanoke, Virginia. My practice begins with movement through the contemporary landscape. These creative practices of pilgrimage have taught me to walk attentively, engage compassionately, trust the tension, and cultivate imagination. My pilgrimage adventures began in 2019 with a journey along the Camino de Santiago, a well-known spiritual path in Spain, and this journey was followed by visits to the Basilica of San Francesco in Assisi and St. Peter's Basilica at the Vatican, among other holy places in Europe. Through visiting these sites, I explored historical, religious, and spiritual frameworks of pilgrimage, and filled many sketchbooks with notes and observations. But with the start of the pandemic, my understanding of pilgrimage began shifting from an adventure in place-making to an experience of displacement, of learning not only to connect with the beauty and sacredness of a holy place, but also to find ways to grow from the tension that arises from instability and uncertainty. Suddenly the world was on pilgrimage, and gathering in the sanctuary for liturgy was no longer a given. And this abrupt closing of churches was a turning point for me as I began to explore how to reimagine the sacred space of a pilgrim. Going to the river to watch the flow between rocks became a spiritual teacher, along with the poem The First Water is the Body by Natalie Diaz. Being a pilgrim in the midst of displacement means noticing how my movement through the landscape moves me to compassion, to acknowledge the layers and layers of history I am now joining, and to sit with the fullness of that sense of being. When I hold these questions and realities when I paint at the river, I'm reminded of the way Annie Dillard engages with the landscape in Pilgrim at Tinker Creek, how she sees the complexity of the landscape with clarity, and poetically describes details of joy and suffering. Like her, I delight in the warmth of the sun bouncing off of the rocks and the specks of vermilion that are beginning to shine through the deciduous trees. And I also sit with the disposed soda cans and the invasive plants and the oily buildup on the water's surface that point to the energy violence that disproportionately affects people of color, this violence that pollutes bodies of water and puts the future of the land in jeopardy. When I paint at the river, I experience visual wonders and the pains and injustices of racism that plague our current moment. And for me, being a pilgrim also still carries the religious and spiritual frameworks, the both holding a sense of awe and interconnectedness of all things, and sitting with the heavy burdens of boarding schools and colonization and scandals that scar the Catholic Church that I call home. I do want to acknowledge that speaking about our contemporary landscape from a place within a church, these words can be hard to hear and hard to say and hopelessly imperfect. But as Nowen, McNeil, and Morrison write in the book Compassion, Reflections on the Christian Life, it is through the recognition of our displacement that we start forming community and living compassionate lives. Only by seeking to name and compassionately engage with the tension and depth of the wounds in our current world can we begin the work of reimagining. So what does being a pilgrim in our contemporary landscape teach us about reimagining church? This is the question that's captivating my imagination right now, because in the midst of displacement, the Catholic Church is having a global synod, listening sessions for the first time in decades, that come with a desire to listen to the movement of the Spirit in our contemporary landscape. I'm starting from a place within the church, but when I do say church, I'm thinking broadly about a place, a community that supports spiritual needs. And as I know from being a pilgrim alongside the river, such a space is not confined to a physical building, nor is the spirit confined to the invisible, immaterial world. When we walk alongside the river of our watershed, we walk on holy ground. Knowing both the church and world are in this transitional time, a kairos moment, an opportune moment for transformation, I've been learning to trust the visual language of painting as a way to cultivate my imagination. By pouring fluid paint and letting the colors pool into one another, drying and then tracing the shapes that emerge, I create contemplative maps that open space for change to happen slowly. The paintings embody the longing for oneness and right relationships that I have internalized from reading Praying with the Earth each day. In this prayer book for peace, Celtic teacher John Philip Newell writes, "We wake not as separate streams, but as countless currents in a single flow." From painting observantly, trusting the tension that comes up, engaging compassionately with it, and allowing myself to respond with an openness to the possibility, I continue to seek ways that ground us in right relationship with one another and the earth. As displaced pilgrims in our contemporary landscape, we can continue this co-creative process of walking towards a new way of being. Thank you.